My name is Richard Gilman Opalski, and I'm Associate Professor here at UIS in the Department of Political Science. And it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce all of you this evening to Dr. Michael Parenti. Dr. Parenti earned his PhD in political science from Yale University and is the author of well over 20 books and several hundreds of articles that have been published in magazines, in newspapers, scholarly journals, including American Political Science Review, Journal of Politics, Social Research, and New Political Science. Dr. Parenti's work has been translated into more than 18 languages, and for over 40 years, Dr. Parenti has lectured frequently and widely throughout the US and around the world. His writings cover a remarkable range of subjects, including US and international politics, media and culture, ideology, political economy, imperialism, religion, communism, capitalism, history, historiography, sexism, racism, academic repression, homophobia, war, foreign policy, and if you can believe it, many others, that if I were to mention all of the subjects he covers, that would be his time.
I'm pretty tired.
Well, you did it. So you've exhausted yourself then. Dr. Parenti has taught political and social science at various colleges and universities and has received numerous awards and distinctions, including the Charles A. McCoy Career Achievement Award for political scientists who have had long, successful careers as writers, teachers, and activists, a distinction he shares with Francis Fox Piven and Carl Boggs, among others. Dr. Parenti is an internationally known and sought-after speaker, and in my humble opinion, for what it's worth, I think one of the great public intellectuals of our time. He writes with an uncommon clarity and humor, especially uncommon if you read political science journals, or for that matter, anything I write. And yet always makes critical interventions into mainstream conversations that regularly misdiagnose our social and political problems. On a personal note, I would share that I've been reading and learning from Dr. Parenti for 20 years. For me, the discovery came through his 1995 book, Against Empire. And since then, I've read almost all of Dr. Parenti's books, save for maybe 3 or 4. And everything I've read, even where there are disagreements, is worth recommending and reading. That said, some of my favorites are Democracy for the Few, Inventing Reality, Against Empire, The Face of Imperialism, God and His Demons. He comes up with some very good titles, too, you might notice. And his latest, Prophet Pathology and Other Indecencies. I should also mention one of his other recent books that I have not yet read is his ethnic memoir, Waiting for Yesterday, Pages from a Street Kid's Life. But you will be rewarded if you start anywhere. You will learn a lot. Indeed, Dr. Parenti has made generations of people critically... What's that?
I said, I'm not that old.
No. It's
Lincoln.
Oh, yeah. All the advertisements about Lincoln don't really help. But people just grow quickly, that's all. So... no, that's okay. You're just making my time longer, which is not what anybody wants. They're all here for you. So, he's intervened and made contributions to discussions on the most pressing controversies in political and social life. As a political philosopher, I read books by a lot of people who I cannot meet and I cannot thank. And I rarely get the chance to thank my teachers. I cannot tell Plato and Kant and Karl Marx and Emma Goldman how grateful I am for what they've taught me. But tonight, I can thank you, Dr. Parenti, so thank you. Now, this event is an ECHE event. An ECHE stands for Engaged Citizenship and Common Experience. Dr. Parenti's work consistently focuses on and encourages engaged citizenship, as his work has informed activists for some time. And common experience is always a central focus, as he focuses on the common experiences of exploitation, of poverty, violence, sexism, racism, manipulation, and others. This event is funded in part by the Carol C. Hall Endowment to further educate Americans about capitalism as a system and philosophy. And for that purpose, we could pick no one better, find no one better than Dr. Parenti. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Parenti.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. I was going to talk about, what was the title of this talk? Capitalism versus Reality. And what I meant was I was going to criticize, and I am going to criticize, the dominant ideologies that hold the system upon us. The dominant orthodoxy today is that the free enterprise system, or capitalism as we know it, has given us democracy and it has given us prosperity. I want to argue that it has given us neither of those two things. In fact, democracy, both economic and political democracy, emerged not along with the growth and accumulation of wealth and capital, but in reaction to it, in resistance to it. The Constitution itself is a document born of that struggle. The Founding Fathers, or framers or delegates to Philadelphia in 1787, those founders who put together and wrote the Constitution, they were rich merchants, they were bankers, landowners, and more than 1/3 of them were slaveholders. Who else, I ask you, who else could spend 4 months in Philadelphia from May to the middle of September 1787 writing a constitution? The dirt farmer can't do that. The servant, the household servant can't do that. The slave working in the field can't do that. He can't even leave his plantation. Who can do that? Only the rich and the well-born, as they called themselves. That's Alexander Hamilton's statement that the country should be led by the rich and the well-born, meaning us guys. And all the other guys are, us, yeah, that's right. They didn't exactly say it that way. But what you had at this convention, and if you go to Philadelphia, this convention hall is still preserved, to this day, or been restored. What you have is what you had there was one individual named James Madison, and what Madison did was all during the convention he kept taking notes, and at night the other guys would go off to an inn or something. He'd go back to his room and he would transcribe the notes. So we have this remarkable document, Madison's Notes on the Constitutional Convention. I read the whole thing and went through the whole thing, in which these people, thinking they are speaking in secret, because they got the windows sealed off, the room closed in. Imagine in the middle of Philadelphia summer, sealing off the rooms with all these delegates jammed in there, and they are putting together a constitution in secrecy. Madison records their remarks, and he joins in. He says, the common people are not to be trusted, and the common people are irresponsible. He moved a little bit more over to Jefferson's side on that. He loosened up a little on that in the next couple of years. But most of the people there, of course, did not change. Those who own the land should rule it. That was John Jay who said that one. So they don't pull any bones about it. They don't make any bones. They pretty much come right out and say what it is. Madison, again, in Federalist Paper number 10, which he published out to the public, the most common and durable source of faction, and by faction he didn't just mean little groups or cliques breaking up, he meant class factions, farmers against merchants against bankers or something like that. The most common and durable source of faction is the various and unequal distribution of property. And by property, he doesn't mean land. Today, when we say property, we usually mean a couple of acres you have there in the house. Property was another word for wealth. So there were people who had wealth. Democracy, as they saw it, was dangerous, and by definition, it was excessive. Democracy was something that led to mob rule. The working poor are riffraff. The Constitution, brothers and sisters, was and is a filtered system. What does it filter? Popular sentiment, popular input, ruled by the common folks. Get a look at your Constitution. You cannot vote for the U.S. president. Nobody has ever voted for an American president. You can only vote for electors in your state. And if those electors of one party win a majority of the vote, they then cast their votes for that president. That's the way it's still working. You're not literally voting for the man, you're voting for an electoral college in your state. That was done because they wanted to filter out the passions of the people. And the passions of the people, and the people were not all crazed and impassioned and outraged about this, that, or the other thing. But they saw people who wanted to challenge us. People who said your property is too much, too fast, too dishonest, too exploitative. We won't stand for it. That's what they saw as wild mob rule and all that, meaning people who are agitating and fighting against their interests and against the injustices that have been perpetrated on them. Senators, nobody, if the Constitution that they set up, nobody could elect senators. The U.S. senators were elected by the state legislators. So again, another filter between what the people want and what was their, how it impact on the rulers. It wasn't until 1917, with an amendment to the Constitution, that we now vote directly for senators, U.S. senators. The Supreme Court, nobody has ever voted for a member of the Supreme Court. He's appointed by the president, and he serves for a lifetime. That is not democracy. That's oligarchy. That's ruled by a few who are unaccountable to anyone else. Then they got to the last part of government, which was the House of Representatives. And that's when finally a few people got up and said, James Wilson of Pennsylvania, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Colonel Mason of Virginia, that was a surprise. Mason University in Virginia, it exists, it's named after him. They got up and they said, look, we got to leave something for the people. They got to be connected to this Constitution. If we block it all out for ourselves, it's not going to get passed and be ratified. So but that fight to get direct representation from the House of Representatives really brought it out in these delegates. They started coming out and talking about the people are riffraff, the people are this, and the people are mindless, and they don't know how to rule themselves, and they need our leadership, and all that sort of stuff. As it was, this Constitution was so completely undemocratic, since it was a concoction of the rich, that it wasn't getting accepted. It wasn't being ratified by the various states. To get it ratified by the states began to ratify the Constitution with a stipulation saying, we will accept this U.S. Constitution and take it on the U.S. government as long as you add human rights to the people. And that's when Madison got down there and he wrote the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which we know as what? The Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights, and that very first amendment is the people shall have the right to peaceful assemble and to have freedom of whatever they want to say and their religious rights and so forth and such. Never said that we have to have religions or we institute any religion in there. Not at all. But, well, enough on the Constitution. That gives you an idea that how qualified our rights were in those days. Let me say something else about the ideology of wealth and how it protects a class system. Wealth and privilege rarely stand naked. Wealth is usually enshrouded in the legitimating myths that treat this or that social order as the natural order. Chinese landlords in feudal China, William Hinton wrote about this in his book Fan Shen. He lived in China right in the middle of the Chinese Revolution too. The Chinese landlords used to have a saying that they used to tell the peasants who worked and half-starved themselves so that the landlord couldn't live good and well and wastefully and whatever else. And the saying was that the sun cannot rise in the west. See, the sun, you can no more rule and run things and push me aside and try to live without me. You can no more rule than can the sun rise in the west instead of coming from the east. And so it is, that's what capitalism gives us today in the ideology that is promulgated. It gives us these mythologies that it fosters democracy. And I was trying to tell you that those of wealth and property and control did not push for democracy. They talked about democracy the way many of the ancient Romans did, as a dangerous thing, a mob rule, a proletarian rabble, and so forth. Okay, I forgot where am I? Doesn't matter. I'm getting there. Okay. Two basic things to keep in mind about democracy. First, it's not a system born of a blueprint. Rather, it emerged in imperfect fits and starts from the field of political struggle, most usually class struggle. In other words, it's not a Grecian urn that comes to us from the Greeks, from Athens, and says, this is democracy, and now we will do it and we will use it. It's a very messy struggle thing, and it's very closely related to class struggle, from the contest between those who possess wealth and property against those who do not. This said, the second consideration becomes evident. Democracy is more than a form of governance. It also has a substantive dimension. So I make a distinction between procedural democracy and substantive democracy, or to put it more bluntly, electoral democracy and economic democracy. We hear that the free market provides for us. We should try and depend on the free market, which is one of the great gifts of capitalism, we're told. Well, we did. We've done it all through most of our history. We've depended on the free market. In 1900, I say the free market, I call it 1900, because you look back at 1900, there were no government regulations to speak of, no minimum wage, no limit on the work day. Workers were sometimes forced to work 12 hours, 14 hours, 15, 16 hours. Kids had to work. 8, 9-year-old kids worked in factories in 1900. That was your free market at work. Unregulated, free to do what you want. No minimum wage. No occupational safety. No consumer protections. You used to eat meat that was diseased and rancid, and people got sick from it. Upton Sinclair, he documented that in his book, The Jungle. And that was well after 1900, too. No consumer protections, no public education in most communities, no hygienic regulations, no housing safety standards. So let the free market take care of that. So that was your free market. That was the democracy. The struggle for democracy, the actual struggle for democracy does not go back to Franklin or James Madison or Hamilton or those people. It goes back over 250 years, 2,500 years ago, long before the Philadelphia Convention. Democracy is a wonderful invention by the people of history who were seeking to defend themselves from the greed and the abuses of wealth. That's what democracy was. Time and again, it comes up as a weapon to be used against the privileges and abuses of wealth. That's what it was in Athens in the 6th century BC, when Cleisthenes got up and ruled and had popular resistance and forces that came along with him to say, we want public control, we want public assemblies, we want rule. The Hoplites, do you know, anybody here know who the Hoplites were? They were Athenians. They were Athenian people. They were farmers, though, and they were the guys who had enough money. I don't know how much money, whatever. They had enough property. Small holders. They were small holders who could buy a shield and a broadsword and serve in the infantry, the Athenian infantry, and they put up one of the first things, with Cleisthenes going along with it. Cleisthenes was an aristocrat. He should have been on the other side with the rich guys. He was one of these aristocrats who sided with the people and was a Democrat. He believed in democracy. Cleisthenes had one of his young lieutenants, one of the best guys who were fighting. He was also a member of his same family, from the same aristocratic family, and he became known as the most famous democratic leader in Greek history, and his name was Pericles. We all in grad school had to read Pericles' monumental statement to the Athenian people and all that. So the Hoplites, these small farmers, said, we want to vote. We want an assembly. We want to make decisions. If we're going to have to fight these wars, we want to be able to vote on whether we can, or whether we want to, and whether we don't, and whether it really serves our interests, and whether it doesn't. And that led to this remarkable thing called the Popular Assembly, where people just had lots, and any week, maybe 10 of you might have drawn lots, which said you got to take 2 days in the assembly and listen to these cases and vote on them. And then there's rotation, you know. All of Athens is before all of Athens that were not in servitude, that were free citizens served. That was a system of democracy. That system, by the way, was really resented by Plato and Socrates. You know, you read Plato's dialogues, and he's got Socrates always talking about, look, a cobbler, a shoemaker should make shoes. He could concentrate on that. That's his gift. Whereas the statesman, which would be one of his rich friends who was out there, the statesman shall rule the state, and everybody in their little spot. The laundry lady will do the laundry, and this person will do that, and all that. And in other words, people should not come out of their little roles and think that they can have a say in ruling themselves. So Socrates was not somebody, I don't adore him quite as much as some of my colleagues in political science do. Um, And there were important issues they fought. They fought over land holdings, wages, rents, debts, taxes, food, the fear of leveling. For Plato makes the point, Socrates makes the point too, that the people who are doing these drudgy jobs should not show up the next week in the assembly. They should just keep doing these jobs. In Sparta, they all love Sparta. In Sparta, those people are helots. They're slaves. And that's the way we want, that's the way we really want it. So the next time your political philosophy teacher tells you, you don't teach political philosophy, do you, Richard? Oh, I'm sorry. But I know he's a Democrat. I know he is. He's classing he's one of those liberals. Huh? A liberal? How do you like that? You're going to hold it against him? No, you can't do that. The struggle, there's something I want to say about this struggle for democracy and how it's against wealth, not wealth coming along, capitalism coming along and freeing everybody to use it, is that the pursuit of economic justice is what leads to the expansion of democratic rights. U.S. workers in the 1820s and the 1830s in America waged, in state by state, they waged, male workers this was, unfortunately it was limited to white male workers, but it was a step in a direction, to fight for the right to vote. Not because they particularly were interested in voting, but what they wanted was a better wage, a wage that they could live with. To get that wage, they had to pressure the bosses. To pressure the bosses, they had to form what were called combinations. But combinations, what today we call unions, but they were called combinations. Combinations, almost every judge in America declared them illegal and out of the way. So to get the right to a combination, you needed to start electing judges. To elect judges, you had to participate in campaigns. To participate in campaigns, you had to have the right to talk. You had to have the right to speak. You'd see organizers would come out into towns and hold leaflets up and all, and the sheriff would come and others would come and bailiffs would beat them up and throw them in jail. So the workers actually had to fight for free speech in order to organize, in order to fight politically, in order to get these material gains of a decent wage and something better, a better life, a better wage, the right to organize combinations. They had to change the law. So in the pursuit of economic democracy, challenging dominant class interests, they end up expanding political democracy. The expansion of political democracy becomes a tool, a more imperfect and inadequate tool for gains, as for instance with the New Deal and such. So with the struggle for civil rights waged by African Americans. If you read the older African American civil rights leaders, even before Martin Luther King, people like William White and others, NAACP and such, they talked about segregation, of course, and Jim Crow and the terrible oppression of it, but they also were hitting bread and butter issues like jobs, housing, protection from police abuse, protection from lynch mob rule, decent living conditions, wages and such. But gains have to be made. An end of mass incarceration, as today is a blooming issue, as you know. Mass incarceration, people getting arrested because a blinker on their car is broke or something, or their driver's license is expired a month ago, or something. That's me, by the way. So. Almost didn't make it here. The same with women and the right to vote and such. The right to vote among women was not merely a gender competition of, well, you men have it, so we women should have the right to vote. Women had very real injustices facing them. If a woman inherited something from her father, she gets married, her husband owns it. They couldn't own property. In one thing after another, they faced very real oppressions in work, in pay, in family, inheritance rights, education, personal safety, reproductive rights, all of which they are still fighting for. And as you can see with this new Congress here, waging war on Planned Parenthood and the like. So what we should do is observe that there's a close relationship between capitalism and democracy, an antagonistic relationship, a conflicting one. Historically, corporate capitalists have had a hard time dealing with democracy. They have opposed almost every democratic advance, the elimination of property qualifications for voting and office holding. The very super rich in America opposed eliminating that. The freedom of an independent press, they opposed that. To this day, they oppose it. The airwaves are the property of the people of the United States, yet the airwaves are licensed out to these big, rich corporations and companies, Fox and CNN and such, and they're controlled by people who have a particular view and who have the money to buy and hold all that airtime. Freedom of an independent press, the right to collective bargaining. We're still fighting, breaking unions today as ever, living wage. They opposed direct elections of office holders. They are still opposing and suppressing voters' registration, making it hard to register. You go to a working guy and say, you got to go to the county office to register before you can vote. Well, the county office is 25 miles away. It's 25 miles there, 25 back. He's just worked a long day. He probably can't even get there before it closes. So he ends up not voting. And it's a way of doing what the framers were trying to do, as you see, which is suppress and make it difficult for the ordinary people, the poor people, to qualify to vote and to participate in this system. They're opposing early voting. Early voting means instead of waiting for that one Tuesday in November, which may not be a day you could even do it, your boss wants you to work 10 hours that day, you can do an early voting. Earlier in the week, there'll be 3 early days or something that you could pick, or a whole weekend where you can go and vote. Accessible registration. The Republican Party today is against early voting. It's for fewer polling stations. It's for briefer voting hours and periods. It's calling for 2 hurdles, a birth certificate and a picture ID, or 2 picture IDs of official documents. You know, I was just thinking, do I have 2 official picture IDs of documents? I do, because I happen to have a passport and a driver's license. Well, there's a lot of people, poor people, elderly people, who don't have driver's license, or there are a lot of people who don't have passports. They don't get an opportunity to travel abroad. Well, to defend their unfair privileges and exploitations, the plutocracy is ruled by the wealthy. Democracy is ruled by the demos. The demos in Greek, in the early Greek language, was the people, ruled by the people. So the plutocracy here, the plutocrats sometimes must resort to force and violence, which they do. Labor battles, breaking unions, breaking demonstrations. Consider the coordinated police repression of the Occupy movement. Do you remember, any of you remember the Occupy movement of 4 or 5 years back or so? Yeah. Well, it was 1% versus 99%. And the problem was the 1%, the super rich, had the police on their sides, a militarized police that went out there and systematically, in 15 major cities, made war against the occupants. Now, the plutocrats themselves today claim that they are proponents of democracy. They defend democracy. They pretend to be its progenitors, not only at home but abroad. In the last half-century, the leading capitalist nations have undermined and destroyed political reformist movements and revolutions in countries throughout Latin America, Central America, Africa, Central Asia, the Middle East, and just about everywhere. In Europe, too, with the destruction of Yugoslavia, which was a social democracy, which President William Clinton bombed for 78 days and nights, and and also infected with depleted uranium, so that in Serbia today, cancer is, they have the highest rate of cancer in Serbia, thanks to President Bill Clinton, who was looking after us, doing all that stuff. And they resist democratization not only at home but abroad. They resist reformist governments that pursue egalitarian economic policies, as in Libya and Syria, but they support those autocrats who pursue free market policies. The capitalist state, and that's what we live under a government that works in a capitalist system. The capitalist state has two core functions. The first is to maintain and advance capital accumulation. That is, the companies, the corporations have to keep making their money, and that process of them accumulating wealth has to be protected, and it's being protected very well. In the last 10 years, all the new wealth that has been produced, it is all in its entirety. Just about all of it went to the top 1%, 1 or 2%. And when I talk about capitalism and such, I'm talking about the giant corporations. I'm not talking about mom and pop small businesses, because that often always comes up. Someone always raises their hand and says, what about mom and pop small business? What about, mom and pop, and they get a little thing together and they sell nice little this, and they make a little money for themselves, and they hire someone, so they create a job and all that. And small business is actually a source of jobs in America. All I can say is, I'm not talking about them. Lenin was right. He said 10 million small businesses count for nothing. A few giant cartels count for everything. A cartel is like the oil cartel, which would be made up of Exxon and Mobil, and all. They collude together, and they divvy out the market, and they play with the prices and the like. Small businesses are like, I call it the squirrels dancing among the elephants. And you know what happens to squirrels would dance among elephants. Have you ever seen it? No, you haven't. But they tend to get smashed and squashed. I think something like, what is it? Is it something? It's over 10,000 small businesses, or maybe it's 5,000. I forget the number now. A week. A number of thousands of businesses a week go out of business, small business. A lot more open up, maybe, but and it is a source of I've been accused of being soft on small businesses, and that's true, I am. As individuals, capitalism does not usually bring out the best in us. We face too many ugly necessities created by the competitive dog-eat-dog system. Unfortunately, capitalism best rewards the worst part of us: ruthless, competitive, conniving, opportunistic, exploitative, acquisitive drives. Private enterprise, as it's sometimes called, gives little reward and often much punishment, or at least much handicap, to honesty, compassion, many forms of hard work, cooperative and collective effort, love of justice and fair play, and a concern for those most in need. There was a great labor union leader who later became a noted socialist leader, American, named Eugene Victor Debs from Indiana. And Debs remarked with bitter irony that to the extent that, that life in an advanced capitalist state is made bearable or decent, barely decent, it's because of the humanizing effects of democratic struggle and labor struggle. Ironically, Debs started figuring all this out while he was in jail. He was leading the railroad strike and all that, and he got beaten up and thrown in jail. I've been beaten up by police and thrown in jail. And let me tell you, when you get slammed in the jail and slammed against the bars and thrown in there and they lock it up, you have time to think, you know. You really sort of sit there and you say, what is going on? What is this all about? Wait a minute. Where's the stars and stripes and all that stuff? Nobody's singing. Nobody's going. And Debs was sitting there and he's saying, this is crazy. Why are the cops on the side of the big bosses? Why aren't the cops out there on the side of the workers? We are the people of society. We're the people who do all those jobs. And then he began to realize that the state is not neutral. That state is not neutral. If there's a disruption and this and that, the state comes out and they start serving the powers that be. Well, but Debs was making this other point, which I thought was very interesting, that the more successful we are, we pull down certain, increases and betterment in wages and this or that and this and that. We make life a little bearable, more bearable. We cut our 14-hour day to a 13-hour day. That's a little bit better, Whatever we try to make this society more human, we are legitimating it. And what we really should be doing is telling the people, look, this isn't for us at all. This is a society that's heartless and inhumane, and we're making it somewhat a little more humane. We create little patches of community and democratic distribution in which we try to live. Is capitalism not a successful economic system? It has success. It has produced, it's the envy of the world, what we have in America. Well, it really isn't. It depends on your position in the social order. Let's start with capitalist leaders. Nancy Pelosi, Congresswoman, Democratic Party, Speaker of the House, in 2008, at the end of Bush's term, George W. Bush's term, she says, Bush is a complete failure on every policy area. I would argue Bush was a smashing success in almost every policy area. Bush himself didn't hold back in his personal praise. He said, and I think he was right, absolutely right, he said he accomplished everything he could do within the strictures of the presidential office, except two things. He failed to undo Social Security. That means pensions, dependency, and disability. That's what Social Security covers. If something bad happens to you, you will not be left to just lie in the street. You do get some support. It's a socialist program. That's socialism at work. And they are dedicated, the conservatives are dedicated to eliminating it every chance they can get, or nibble away at it, or break it down, minimize it. Bush also pointed out that he brought in, no, he doesn't point it out. I'm pointing it out what Bush did. I'm sorry. Bush had provided massive increases in the military budget. A military budget that went from $250 billion to something like 526 billion. Today, under Obama, it's closer to $1 trillion a year. $1 trillion a year. Some of that money comes from the Energy Department, some of it comes from other things, some of it comes from these other wars that are then slapped onto this budget as an extra budget. Massive shifts in tax burden from the working class, to the working class and middle classes. Tax burden, cutbacks and defunding and deregulation of human services, including public education and environmental protections, massive debt, which helps to defund government, defunds human services. Wait a minute, I've said all that, didn't I? I'm sorry. Kill these programs, not because they don't work, but because they do. That's why they want to get rid of Social Security, not because it doesn't work, but because it does. It's been about the best check on poverty, elderly poverty, that we've had. Capitalism is less successful in the more prosperous countries. That is, a country that is prosperous, like Finland, Norway, Denmark, Sweden. These are the social democracies. After World War II, they faced the Red Army on the Elbe, along the Elbe River. They faced all of Eastern Europe was now communist. All these communist countries were now providing Social Security, old age pensions, supports, guaranteed right to a job to every worker, free medical care to every worker. This was going on in the communist countries. Subsidized rent and housing. No worker could spend more than I think it was 15% of his salary on rent. So you were guaranteed. You didn't have to put all your money on your housing. These kind of things were very embarrassing. And after World War II, you had a very strong social democratic parties, including some communists, voting and bringing in governments that did these generous human services for all, more equitable tax system, consumer and worker protections, excellent utility and transportation services, and then all the things I just mentioned about the other social democracies. But social democracies are recent. And they're never really secure. Look what's happened in the United Kingdom. It's rolling back now since Tony Blair. They've been undermining it and cutting it back, and the Brits are paying more and more and getting less and less for it. And there are cutbacks all through Western Europe because there's no more Eastern Europe. There's no more communism. The Red Army's gone. The big communist parties in France and Italy are pretty much gone. So they don't have to, the guys at the top no longer have to make frightened concessions to the mass of the people. In contrast to the social democracies of Western Europe, I mean, they're still pretty good. They're better than what we've got. I mean, if you were ill, you're much luckier to be ill in Finland than in the United States. Capitalism is a more complete success in countries like Indonesia, Nigeria, Colombia, El Salvador, places like that. That's where, let's take Indonesia. And by successful, I mean more successful in serving that 1% at the very top. They don't have to kick back for all these regulations and all these human services and such. In Indonesia, there's no customer service or warranties on commodities. Drinking water is privatized and unclean. You have to buy drinking water, and you got to hope it's clean. No public health services, no environmental protections, chaotic auto traffic, regular bus plunges, buses going off because roads are so poorly graded and unfixed, rampant crime, terrible poverty, but the rich in Indonesia, they live so well. They live in such lush luxury. They have small armies of servants who serve them. And the servants are de facto slaves. And if the servant doesn't want to serve and wants a day off or wants that, he or she can be kicked out. And there'll be 5 other people waiting at the gate to come in and serve. And so that's the kind of world that the capitalists want, a world of billionaires who can call their shots and the rest of us lining up with bowed head. Capitalism makes a claim not only to democracy, but to prosperity. Not true. The goal is private wealth for the few and public poverty for the many. And that's what I was saying about Indonesia and the like. The poorer and hungrier you are, the harder you will work for less and less. And the more surplus value I, the boss, can extract from you. Free enterprise and competition are widely celebrated as part of the dynamic and abundance of capitalism. In fact, the corporate enterprise system almost always is in a state of crises. Even in the USA, abnormality is normality. Recessions, 1780s, terrible recessions, terrible fights about land rents and taxes and such. It led to Shays' Rebellion, and Shays' Rebellion led to the Constitutional Convention. They hurried together to whip together a stronger government to stop this kind of thing. 1805 panic, 1820s recessions, 1850 market crashes, 1873 a whole decade of depression. Another whole decade, 1890s. Teddy Roosevelt, 1896, saying, this country needs a war, any war. And he got it in 1898, which was what? The Spanish-American War. 1910, 1920s. The 1920s were a recession time. I never learned that. We always learned the 1920s were what? The jazz age, right? The roaring 20s, they would call. Charleston. With very little inducement from you, I can do the Charleston, right? But I won't. This went on through the whole 1920s. You know where the recession was in the 1920s? It was mostly in rural areas, which is probably why it could go undetected. But in the rural areas, it was very hard on people, both black and white. Then at the end of that decade, in October 1929, came the great crash of the stock market, and the Depression came. That Depression lasted from 1929 to 1941. It ended in 41-42 because the U.S. was now in a major global war against Japan and Germany. And the 1941. This is where you got to take a look more closely, because this explains the great American prosperity, and it did come around that time. I remember my uncle Nick and my dad and my Uncle Joe all talking and moaning about how the war is going to be over fairly soon. I think it was coming, like Germany was just about falling, and Japan they were waiting for them to surrender. And we're going to be hit with a terrible depression again. I said, why? I always used to hear about this thing called the depression. The depression. You're surprised to know I was even alive then. I look so young, don't I? You thought I was like like 35 or 40? I know. Okay, yeah, right. They understood that 9 million young American men and some tens of thousands of women are going to come back out of uniform and come back into the economy. There's going to be no jobs. Where are all the jobs going to be? See, the Depression ended in 41 because the U.S. was ready to really spend. They spent deficit spending. They spent enormous amounts of money to do in war what they would never do in peace, which was to build all these planes and tanks and whatever else. But when the war was over, these 9 million of these people who came back entered the GI Bill of Rights. GI Bill. The GI Bill was a tremendous program. It brought to every veteran from the war could go back to school, and he would get a full stipend and a full payment of his tuition fees, also a scholarship. and or others could start small businesses, and others could do all sorts of other kinds of things. It turned out to be one of the most economically terrific things. GI veterans who hadn't finished high school were now becoming accountants who are going on into other professions. It actually enriched the whole economy terrifically. Another thing that happened was all during the war, people like my Uncle Nick, who used to make $50 a week as a garage mechanic, was now, he quit being that during the war, and he went to work in a war factory and making planes and this and that. So you had people now doing all this kind of work and coming away with lots of money. The trouble is they had nothing to buy. I remember that too during the war. Everything was rationed. So you had all this money now, but you couldn't buy. The factories were no longer making electric toasters or refrigerators or cars or anything like that, or houses. The factories were making planes and tanks, and you couldn't buy a tank, and you didn't have much use for a tank anywhere. But so you had this immense backlog of buying power. And that's really one of the problems of recessions is, of course, you haven't paid your workers enough money to buy back the goods and services that they're producing. And that's why you have a recession. So all of that was changing. The GI Bill and then this and you from 1947 to, I would say, 1979, 1981, during the last 2 years of Carter, where he started selling out, and the introduction of Ronald Reagan coming in, up until that time, that's the immense prosperity you got. Building of suburbia, building of highways, the kind everything you see and take for granted now, freeways and highways, all those things, they didn't exist back when I was graduating from school. When we heard that the Pulaski Highway in Jersey, did you hear about it? You can go 60 miles an hour. Wow, 60 miles an hour. Yeah, a mile a minute. Well, that's only 60 miles an hour. What's so fast about that? We learned later on as more and more cars came out and this and that. So there was this kind of backlog of consumer hunger, a consumer hunger that's backed by money, by ability to buy for it. And that's what became that became the basis of the great prosperity, a prosperity which is now eluding us, a prosperity which is declining and declining. You hear reports about 20,000 more new jobs, but they don't tell you about the quality of the jobs, the paying of the jobs, the durability of it. As part of the myth of prosperity, the Horatio Alger myth, as you know it, the view that every generation is more prosperous than the previous one, it just isn't so. In the last 20 years, all the new wealth created went to the top 2 or 3% in the last 20 years. The rest of us have worked harder and stayed much in the same place. And if you're working harder and harder to stay in the same place, you're not staying in the same place. You know, you're being extracted. Our national debt is greater and greater. It's up to, what, 17 trillion now? We, the taxpayers, owe that. The national debt belongs to us. Karl Marx made that point in Capital, Volume 1, where he said, of all the things in society, the one thing that belongs to the people is the national debt. They own it. They'll be taxed. They have to pay it. And they pay it to those who own all those U.S. bonds, those national bonds and such, which are the rich. So this recession that we've been living in now, the 2008-9 one that's still going on at 2015, these recessions, it's like all recessions, it has certain advantages, not for us, but for the 1%, the people at the very top. It wipes out weaker competitors. It allows mergers at more affordable costs, concentrations. Marx called that, he even had a phrase in and I'll tell you again, Volume 1, Chapter 32. Chapter 32 or Chapter 23? A lot you care, but one capitalist, the phrase was, one capitalist will kill many capitalists. Back in 1910, you had something like, I would say, there must have been 20 or 30 auto factories, auto businesses arising. About 13 of them provided electric cars, believe it or not. The electric cars got wiped out, though, and the others came in. By the great prosperity, we're talking now no longer about businesses, we're talking about giant corporations. You had only 3 auto companies, right? Ford, Chrysler, what was the third one? General Motors, the biggest, I forgot it. Yeah, General Motors, right, thank you. And that's the way it is with the oil companies. That's the way it was with the meat packing companies. There must have been about 200 meat packing companies to play safe, I'll say by World War I or by 1920, that had broken down to Armour and Swift and 1 or 2 others, about 4 or 5 of them. I'm thinking of the book, gosh, you see, that's the trouble, you can't remember it. The Triumph of Capitalism. Who wrote that? No, the Triumph of Conservatism. I'm trying to remember. It was about that turn of the century where the cartels and these few big companies took over. And it happens all the time. I think it happened with computers, didn't it? I mean, there were all sorts of little companies starting up, people's garages and this and that, and then it gets back down to what? 3 or 4 companies, giant companies with billions of dollars. Well, that doesn't mean that these big companies don't take money from the government. They do. They don't want you to take money from the government. They don't want you to get food stamps. They don't want you to get rent subsidies. But they take money. They take billions every year. They take over land, for instance. What the Pentagon does with some of the large what? I know. You know, I'm half deaf too, so I can't. Douglas, McDonnell Douglas, right? Well, they'll give them the land, they'll give them the materials. They can build the factory, and then they can produce whatever new jet or new rocket or new instrument of death is needed, and this is all done compliments of the taxpayers. Okay. The goal of giant global capitalism is the third worldization, not only of the U.S. economy, but of the entire world. I've written books on that. The U.S. global military machine undermines any country, any government, any leader that uses the land, labor, capital, and natural resources for the development of their own country. So we have not only public suppression and impoverishment at home, but we got it around the entire globe, with wars 2, 3, 4 at a time, military bases, hundreds of them around the world. The empire feeds off the republic. The face of imperialism, I called it. $1 trillion a year is spent from the Pentagon budget and related budgets, increasing the deficit into trillions upon trillions. I didn't do much about foreign policy. I was trying to concentrate on the whole ideology of it and such. I advocate socialism when it works and because it works. The post office, it works. They're trying to bust up the post office, and they're doing a good job of it now, the Republican Congress is. But it was a very decent kind of thing. It was the largest union workers, a group of union workers in any one enterprise. You could deliver, you still can deliver for 47 cents. You can deliver a letter from your door to someone 3,000 miles away, or I'm sorry, we're not in California. Someone 1,500 miles away in L.A. And for 45 cents, 47 cents, you can do that. Social Security, we've got, and I like that. I think it's fair, it's humane, it's decent. Medicare, when it works, against a prohibitive, profit-driven medical and insurance corporations. Public health care for everyone and everything. Housing, transportation, as in France, for instance, or Japan, where they've got these tremendous super monorail trains that go that cannot be derailed, haven't lost a passenger in 10, 15 years, have given out billions of rides and the like. I like that. Public utilities, I find that's better than private utilities. I live in California, and I got PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric. Well, it's the highest rate. It's the highest. They talk about private competition, and we're efficient, and we give you. Well, they don't do that at all. They charge us the highest rates in America. If you had a public utility, that public utility doesn't spend millions of dollars on advertising. It doesn't spend millions of dollars on its CEO bosses having to be paid 30, 40, 50 million a year. The public utilities are much safer. PG&E got a $45 million handout from the state of California to start checking up on the gas leaks in this whole system of gas. And it didn't do it. It even got, in San Bruno, it got complaints from people who were smelling gas, and it didn't do it. It used that money to wage a proposition campaign, to have a proposition which said that only private utilities can function in California, no public utilities. And they had millions of dollars to spend, and the miracle was that they lost. The people voted against that. The people are interested in socialism, as long as you don't call it socialism and you just give them the benefits and the functions of it. And so what PG&E did was they spent all that money on that campaign. They lost the campaign, but in San Bruno there was an explosion, a gas explosion, a gas leak, and 8 people were killed and 40 homes were blasted. I saw photographs of it. I treated it in my book, Profit Pathology. I had a little bit of a chapter on that. And public education is being destroyed, as we see before our own eyes, where students are having to pay for education when they were supposed to get one that was free with minimal costs. Where professorships are getting wiped out and adjuncts are being used. An adjunct is a teacher who gets paid only by a course, one course here, one there, and all that. Very poorly paid, hard to survive. And this is what's happening. And the money goes to the big administrators and goes to the presidents of the universities and the regents and the like. So you turn the university into something that resembles a private corporation. We hear that we must fix the system. Unfair tax distribution, insufficient health care goes on, low wages, wage theft, all sorts of inequities. But no, some of us argue, the system is fixed. It's rigged already. It is the way they want it to work. As far as they're concerned, these last 10 years haven't been so bad. Hasn't been bad. It's fine. Things are going fine. What are you so upset about? But tell me, and I've had students say, I'm going to close right here. I've had students say, one time when I was teaching at SUNY, State University of New York, in Albany, the students said, but what socialism, how would it work? It's a dream, isn't it? A dream in theory and a nightmare in practice. That's a phrase I myself coined just to sum it up for their anxieties. You think it's a dream in theory and a nightmare in practice. My students at SUNY, they would say, how would it work? And I would say, well, you're sitting in it right now. You are too, or less and less, of course, as they privatize it. Better than private colleges on Long Island and more affordable because before they raised tuition horribly and privatized private education. And so I'm for that. I'm for real public education. I'm for real public utilities, for public housing that's affordable and made in a humane fashion, public transportation, public hospitals. So I advocate socialism because it works when it works. Small business, small services, maybe they could also work and have a place there. End the power of these giant corporations, bring back real democracy and real prosperity. Thank you for your kind attention, folks. That went too long, isn't it? We're going to have a Q&A now.
Yes, yes.
Uh-oh, are we on now? Yes.
We have some time and space to have some questions and conversation about some of the topics, points, arguments of Dr. Parenti. And I will help moderate that discussion. And why don't we just see who's got something to say?
I don't know. Am I on?
You are on.
I'm on?
That is a hot mic.
I did it right. How do you like that?
Dr. Parenti, I was just wondering, you said that universities, the education system, is aligning more closely with capitalism, privatizing, and becoming more consumeristic in nature. With that being said, do you believe that the university still has a role to play in the public sphere, in democratic struggle? And what might that role be if so?
Well, that's another thing they did. That is, they've taken students. Students have been a very political activist group, social group in America. If you go back to the Vietnam War, and you even go back during the Depression and such, students often showed up and fought for good causes. What we got now, though, are students who are getting crushed by debts. You know, it's hard to go out there and spend weeks organizing and such when you got $75,000 debt that comes up when you're going to graduate next week. So, so what was your question again? I'm sorry.
The question, actually, I was just asked to repeat the questions because for the audio recording, none of you can actually be heard. So I will do my best to repeat in short form the question. So the question was, with the privatization of public universities and universities in general, do you think that the university still has a role to play in what you called substantive democracy?
Yes. Universities throughout history, not just here, but in Europe and such, have always had a role to play. The youth are people who know the score. They are exposed to the contradictions of the situation, and they often have very idealistic commitments. They do. I remember that during the Vietnam War. I wasn't a student. I already was a teacher. And I would get up there, and we'd get on that line and face the cops down, and it wasn't for, and we were characterized as just a bunch of vandals, just a bunch of blowhards and stupid and obscene and potheads and so forth and so on. I mean, so who do we face? We face these cops who are heavy drinkers and got clubs in their hands and want to beat up defenseless. They're very brave. They're very brave when the other guys don't. When the other side has no armament or anything, then they're ready to hit and kill, as we still see today, don't we? So my answer is yes. The plutocrats always saw the students as a problem, and as people who agitate and confront things, and there are too many of them gathered all in one place, and that's dangerous. Did I answer your question somewhat? The board of trustees of these universities are just like the board of trustees from corporations. They're made up of big company guys, General Motors, General this, General that, and the other thing. And they get paid the salaries. You know better than me about the recent times, right? They're getting paid Quite a bit. I won't put you on the spot. I know you're still working here. That's right. It's good to associate now and then with someone who has a job. I can tell you, makes me feel good. You know. Yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you for coming, Mr. Parenti. I remember when I was in Dr. Domopolsky's several of his classes, we ended up doing an independent study. And Dr. Domopolsky recommended that we do an independent study about Michael Parenti.
Not too close now. What do you mean? Sounds like I've got some problems. Or something.
You didn't see us looking through your window?
No competition on your books, and we went through it, and we actually exchanged some emails.
What was the reaction of the students to the books?
Well, it was just he and I.
Oh, I
we
see.
just read your books and discussed it, and I wrote some papers about it. So I'm really excited to have you here. Hearing you speak, you remind me a lot of a presidential candidate that's out there hitting the trail right now, and I'd like to hear what your take was on Bernie Sanders, because as a former Marine, a combat veteran, someone who studied you, now I follow the man. His stump speeches sound a lot like what you were talking about tonight. So what is your take on Bernie Sanders?
So the question is, what is Dr. Parenti's view of Bernie Sanders?
Well, Bernie and I were very close friends for years. He'd come over my house when I lived in Washington D.C. He came with his son once, and my son was visiting me. I made them dinner. Bernie and I both ran on the Liberty Union ticket in Vermont. I ran for the House of Representatives. Vermont has only one congressman, so you can't get gerrymandered out. But it meant I'd go up and down the whole state, and I got 7% of the vote. Bernie ran for Senate, U.S. Senate. He got 2% of the vote. Not that I'm trying to be committed. And very close to Bernie. His last words to me, I remember when he came to, where the hell was it? In Washington, I think it was. No, it was right in Berkeley, California, when I was living there. Bernie came to Oakland, and he said, "Where have you been? I haven't seen you. Stay in touch with me." I said, "Oh, sure, I will, Bernie." But then came the Yugoslav war, and Bernie sided with President William Clinton and supported the bombing of Yugoslavia, 78 days and nights, depleted uranium, which has left Serbia today with the highest cancer rate in all of Europe. I vigorously opposed that war and wrote a book about it called To Kill a Nation, the attack on Yugoslavia. And Bernie, as I told Huck was a good friend. I forget Huck's last name. He was a professor from the university who took a leave to go work in Bernie's office when Bernie was now in the House of Representatives. Bernie went to the House of Representatives. He got elected mayor of Burlington and then House of Representatives and then the U.S. Senate. And now he's doing this try for the presidency. What was I saying just now?
What do you think of his campaign, and what do you think of his bid for the presidency?
No, there was something I wanted to say about this. I hate when this happens. When I get tired, that's what starts happening.
You guys split over the Yugoslav war.
Yugoslav war, yeah. I said he's standing shoulder to shoulder with NATO and the CIA and the White House and Bill Clinton and these creepos for a war against these people like this. I said and that's when I broke with him. I stopped sending contributions. I stopped. Furthermore, his salary was way bigger than what I was making. And so when I saw that he was running, and I put on the little thing to see some of the events with 10,000 people, I must admit I sat there and it was very touching, and I was so happy to see it. I was very happy to see Bernie getting up there, 10,000 people, and the powers that be have to deal with him in some way now. He's like a big blister in the way, and they got to deal with him and say, well, blah, blah. And mostly they don't say too much. They just concentrate on Donald Trump, you know. Yeah, I think it's great. The trouble is he's still not saying anything about foreign policy. He's still not criticizing. The empire feeds off the republic. We don't need an empire with 70 military bases, 700 military bases all over the world. We don't need to be fighting 2, 3, 4, 5 wars all at the same time. This is crazy. That's all. Bernie hasn't said a word about those things. He hasn't. He's just not said anything about it. So he's good on local issues. He's really, I think, he's a liberal Democrat. He's not a socialist or not even really a left progressive. He's just sort of he'd be a good liberal Democrat. But look at what he says. He says, and we want the rich to pay their share too. What do you mean? We want to stop having the rich rule our lives and rule our minds. That's what we want. And I think he could do a lot better on that. And he's going to have to say, it's not just me. I was alone years ago about his position on foreign policy, but a number of other people have brought it up now too. So he will have to start saying something about foreign policy, which would put him at odds with the national security state boys who play for keep. When you get into arguments with them, you got to be careful about your plane crashing or your car skidding and going off the road, or a lone assassin coming over and killing you, you know, as John Lennon happened to him, remember, and a few others, supposedly.
In the back, yeah.
Please stand up and speak louder, because you got. I'm 82 years old, and I am 82, and I can't hear very well.
And my question is, you speak a lot about capitalism and how corporations are controlling the decisions that's going on in our society. What are some suggestions from your perspective on how to combat those issues so that we can move from that type of point of view and that control that the community has?
So let me just repeat the question. The question is, what are some things that we can do to combat or counteract the control of capital, of money, over our lives? Is that fair? Okay, thank you.
We could go through this talk again and pick out things. We could get rid of the 40, 50, 60 billion dollar direct subsidies that are given to corporate America for export supports, for equity freebies, all sorts of things that they get. Look at the farm bill every 2 years. My God, the payoff. And it doesn't go to poor Joe the farmer or Joe the plumber. It goes to big agribusiness. That's who. So you can stop doing that. You could start organizing. You could start organizing the work in a more communal and communitarian way. And we have evidence that Americans are quite capable of doing communitarian work. You don't have to be a Chinese peasant who does it from feudal times or something or other. People of all sorts immediately see where their interests are, and they have skills and all that, and they could do those things. So that's what I would say. I would say we'd have to start moving away. Look, this system wouldn't survive if it wasn't the federal government pumping it and giving it what it is. One of the things that the capitalist system needs is what the government is there for, is to protect the capitalism, to protect the capitalists from the capitalists. As I said, one capitalist can kill many capitalists. It's a cannibalistic system too. So these are some of the things you would do, and there are others too. It's an interesting question. You could start, because you already have people doing it. Gar Alperovitz has written a number of books on this, about the worker communitarian ways that workers who own their own factories and work for nonprofit Everybody gets a salary. So maybe some people who have more responsibilities and longer hours will get more salary, a little more salary. But there are thousands of workers in America who work in worker-owned businesses, and that could tell you then how it could be done, and they'd be perfectly right, and with regulations to make sure that these products are safe, because you could have workers producing something that's not safe either, you know. Okay.
Yes. Yes, you. I'm sorry.
Sorry, what you're talking about also makes me wonder what your thoughts are on the stock market and how that.
Got any good tips? No.
I guess I feel as if the common man's involvement in the stock market and how much we are leveraging our futures on the profitability of stocks is a direct contributor to some of the ills that we have now. What are your thoughts?
The question, to repeat it for the recording and probably for the people in the overflow room as well, is to get some of your thoughts on the stock market, on financial capital, and all that.
Yeah, hearing it twice, I still don't know quite what to say. No, but it's true. It is it's shameful that people who've worked hard and saved their money then have to gamble it on the market because they realize they don't have enough and they're going to drop dead in a year or two. They got to hope that they'll drop dead in a year or two so that they can not be penniless or end up out on the sidewalk. And so they go into the market and they do that. That's true. That's true and it's true that as people get older, but they're getting poorer, the way this system is rigged, that contradiction is going to get more intense. And the market becomes a place where people hope they can make money without working. That's what the capitalist does. And it's a big gamble. It's a big shoot. But the people who are most successful at it are the people who spend all their time with it and who have diversity of investments. The Warren Buffett said, you know, he's most successful. You guys all are going out and you're taking a dive and your stock is worthless. I'll buy it up. Why will I buy it up? I'll buy it up because I can get it for a penny, and then once it starts climbing back up again, I'll sell it. So you sell when your stuff is going high. You sell then, and when it's going low and it's going out, and then you buy those. That's what you buy. That's how Buffett made his billions. And so the whole thing becomes a casino game, you know. Might as well go to Vegas because it's a terrible way to have to end your life, struggling in that manner.
I might just add one point to this on you mentioned the Occupy, well, that was called Occupy Wall Street. And
right.
So a part of the sensibilities of that movement took aim at what we call the phase of financial capital, which is more this abstract, you know, placeholders for money, and you start to talk about, which enable you to talk about a market that's performing well or not, completely unrelated to people's everyday experiences in the real world. So I think there is an ability, and I think Occupy Wall Street reveals that, of everyday people, young people, to be able to see the dissonance between the performance of the market and the performance of the capitalist reality. So if you turn on the TV, you oftentimes will see the stock market is doing well, the Dow Jones is up. But that's an utterly irrelevant piece of information for a person who doesn't have a job. And for most people who do, it's also irrelevant. For people who do have jobs, that information is sometimes equally irrelevant. And so I think there is a sensibility there that's also really important to start talking about financialization, the stock market, and Wall Street, because capital, I think, functions not in the old way of always, you know, you have production centers where you see the worker and the boss. It's become increasingly abstract with globalization, harder to see where it works and how it works. And it's one of the things where I think people oftentimes talk about Occupy Wall Street as something that's over and done and therefore, a failure. But I think it was, and still remains, remarkable evidence of the ability of everyday people to see the source in an increasingly abstract economic system.
Excellent response. Yeah, I agree. And you call on.
Okay. Go ahead. Yeah. Yes. Well, let's try now, because we have gone a bit. We shouldn't go on too much longer. Let's try now to get less, if not. Let's eliminate introductory comments and just get questions, because we're going to run out of time, and there are a lot of people who aren't going to. I'll say this already in advance. There are a lot of people who are not going to get to speak, and I apologize in advance for that, but we can't take all the questions. Go ahead.
Actually, I have 3 questions, and I'll go fast. One thing, they talk about innovation. Innovation and capitalism kind of go together. And to have growth, you need innovation. So how does innovation stack up with a communist state or a socialist? 2, as far as using Denmark, etc., with Scandinavian countries, they get the benefit of the rest of the world having a military, the United States and the rest of the world doing development in pharmaceuticals and so forth, so they get the benefit of that, and they don't have to spend the money on that. They can spend it on social. Number 3.
Oh, wait. We just got to take you.
No.
I'm 80, so I'm going to forget. I know you're 82, so I'll forget what I'm going to say it, but I'll say it. So, see? Mankind is mankind, and no matter what system we have, socialism,
Why did you call on this guy?
or capitalism, mankind is flawed. There are people who want to steal, there are people who want to take advantage, there are people who want to get ahead before anyone else.
It is because people are imperfect that you don't build a system that feeds their imperfections and harms their perfections. That people who want to help, want to do things, want to make it all fair and square, they get into trouble, they get unrewarded, they often get punished, whereas the people who pursue money in the most treacherous and amoral ways, they get benefited. And you're telling me about them. You're saying we can't do without them. You got it in your brain that we can't do without the people who steal and deceive and plunder and produce and innovate. They do innovate in many ways. Adolf Hitler innovated too. Well, the question is not, and there was innovations in communist countries. I'm sure some of those things were. I went to Cuba and I saw things they did, and I saw other things they didn't like and all that. And it should be open, and it should be open and be able to be debated. That's why I called for services. Cuba's going to have to. Cuba's already doing some of that, services and such, instead of letting everything be held by the government. That's impossible. You can't do that. But the government, you need a government that is going to help parse out things fair and square, and I think they do. They do that. I was just thinking, for instance, one of the small businesses they have in Cuba are women's. What is it called? Hairdressers, beauty parlors. There are women's beauty parlors. They're held in women's houses, and all that, and it's allowed. And the communist government had to back off. You don't get between a woman and her hair. A woman's hair is an ongoing dynamic all the time, and so you can see how innovations. You can see things that are wrong. I was talking about plumbers who were terrible in Cuba. They go and they fix here and they leave it draining over there, and they don't care. They go home. Restaurants in the Soviet Union, the last thing you want to do as a restaurant manager is have a big clientele that likes your food. They come a lot, and you got to serve it to them and all that. The less I have to serve out, the more I can take home and black market. That would be a kind of example of what you're talking about. Well, how do you stop that? Well, you can stop that. You can have social services. My position is where small business can operate, then have small businesses. And restaurants would be one example, because the last thing the restaurants owners in Russia wanted to do was to please a lot of people and serve them out. The less I served out, the more I had to sell on the black market or take home from my family or neighbors or whatever. It was a corrupt thing. And there are mythologies about it too. I mean, they thought things were so perfect, and they weren't perfect. But don't forget, the Soviet Union, there's not a single socialist country that didn't produce its world not being under fire. They all were under fire all the time. The Soviet Union's history, you look at just about every year in its history, and there was a crisis, there was invasions from the West, there was war, there was civil wars, there wasn't one normal year where these people could sit and work it out for themselves and for each other. They couldn't do that. And so they also would compensate with myths about their country. Like, I remember when I was in Moscow, our guide, she said, "There's no prostitution in my country." I said, "What? What? No prostitution? This is a country of what, like almost 400 million people at that time. No prostitution?" I said, "Well, there may not be any prostitution in your country, but there's quite a bit in our hotel here." And then without missing a beat, she says, "Yes, I want you to know all those girls have day jobs and they work too." I said, "Oh, that fixes, that settles it. There's a little extra change here."
We take a few more.
So, we could go on with your questions. Mm-hmm. And it's a good question, though. Yeah.
Good, Ashley. Yeah.
Just to talk about organization a little bit, I find that the biggest obstacle to organizing workers is these kind of false struggles that capitalism places upon workers. It's like, people that ought to be uniting because they're in the same sort of boat that capitalism puts them in. But the rural and the urban divide gets, especially in Illinois, a lot of play. And we fight against each other when we really should be struggling against the bigger corporations. How would you recommend, or things that you've seen successful in kind of bridging those false mythologies of capitalism that divide workers?
Rephrase that.
Okay, so I mean, there's a couple of things there, and I'm not sure if I'm going to get it exactly right, but correct me if I'm wrong. The one is a question about how does organization look when you're organizing to confront mythologies. Is that fair? Yeah. So if a part of what we have to do is confront the capitalist mythology, how do we do that? With what resources? How do we deal with the deficit?
All we have to do, is that what you said?
How would we do it? What are some ways that we might be able to do that? Right,
because there's a lot of other things you have to do. This is just one thing I was talking about. Yeah, so say that again, the last one.
So what are some organizational strategies or forms or things that we might do together to confront and debunk capitalist mythologies?
Right now, well, first thing is we have to inform ourselves about it, about what's going on. What is Monsanto? Why do they do these things? Why aren't these people being shot? We have to ask those questions. No. Did I say that? I'm so tired.
Did I mention the mic was hot? Yeah. Right.
Oh, I was on? Oh, my God. Yeah, Monsanto is a wicked, evil corporation. It really is, among the worst. So you're saying that people are not developing a critical perspective of how this thing operates? Is that what it would?
And I think you have groups of workers set against each other when you should be, working against the system.
Yeah. I I remember construction work. It was in Vermont, as a matter of fact, back when I was doing union support work there. He looked at one of the brochures for the Liberty Union Party, which Bernie Sanders was running into. Took the paper and he saw our program. He says, these are all good ideas except this last one. You know what the last one had? It had the word socialism in it. That we could adopt certain forms of democratic socialism so that people can all participate. Blah, blah, blah. That he didn't know what the hell socialism was. He was accepting it in the actual content, you know, public transportation, public utilities. Yes, this is But then he didn't. He was afraid of a word, and they've got us afraid. That's why I think it's really terrific of Bernie to come out and say, yes, I'm a socialist. But then when he gets into particulars, socialist means put a little more taxes on the rich, or put a lot more taxes on the rich, and less on people who can barely make it now. I mean, that any good liberal would support that, you would think, if there were still some good liberals left in American politics. I don't know. Mm-hmm. Let's go on. I'm sorry, we haven't done justice.
Maybe get a few more. Go ahead, Andy. I would like to, if we can't conclude by 9 for sure. Yeah, because that's another 15 minutes. Is that okay, Michael?
So I could stay. Okay. I mean, I'm here now. The tough part is flying here.
You mentioned PG&E, and here in Springfield we have a City Water, Light and Power, which is a publicly owned utility. In other words, it's not owned for profit, it's not owned by an individual or family, and it doesn't sell stock on the stock market. Is that the sole criteria for a socialist enterprise? You also mentioned Social Security as being a socialist program, yet these two entities exist within the capitalist system. So, and yet, in ways they almost support the capitalist system. So could you elaborate on that a little bit? And Dr. Pathology, please jump in if you want.
Thanks. The question is, we have in Springfield City Water, Light and Power, which is a public utility by some measures, but I mean, I'm not sure. So what, I guess, how would the question be?
What's your complaint about it?
Yeah.
What is it?
Well, I don't really have to complain about it. I'm for it, essentially. But
why are you for it?
Because for a long time we had the lowest electric rates, and also it is accessible as far as I know. Their Sierra Club is approaching them about a lake they want to build, and they're also the rate, they proposed a rate structure which is good for the utility but bad for the ratepayers and bad for conservation. So basically my question in regards to your talk is, you have a socialist enterprise as CWLP, you have a socialist program like Social Security, but exists within a capitalist system. And are these movements towards change? Are these good? Do they support the capitalist system? Is that
sure they do. What you mean? The public utility supports cap? Well, I guess it might. It has to function in a capitalist system, but no, it's not supporting capitalism. Capitalism is when these lights go on and somebody is making money off the fact that these lights are on. Somebody who doesn't work with these lights, who doesn't work with anything we do, but something comes out of your pocket. If you're paying for this, if you're paying with your tuition some of the expenses of this university, you're paying for these lights, and the Koch brothers, maybe they're the guys involved in it, or David, the Koch brothers, right? Mm-hmm. Or maybe David Rockefeller or somebody. Every time in New York, every time I would put the light on, I was helping Nelson Rockefeller and David Rockefeller. They were making him richer. Why? What do these people have that they can get billions and billions of dollars? Walmarts. Why must we? What did Walmarts ever invent? What did the Walton family? The Walton family, of the top 10 richest people in America, 4 of them are from the Walton family. Of the top 25, I think it's about 6 or 7 altogether. Add up all their wealth, it's over $150 billion. Now, what did they do to get this kind of money? And what is, whose money is that? It's our money. We got to pay it up. And they so underpay their workers that their workers have to go out and get food stamps. They're so underpaid that around Christmas time, they ask the public to come in and toss in cans of food and all for their own workers. They're shameless, these Walton family. They're shameless about it. And they get richer and richer. They got more money than they could spend in 5 lifetimes in the most freest way, wildest way. What is that about? This is a rational system. This is the way our people, we got people struggling and fighting, paying the Waltons for doing nothing and just riding on our backs. So that's why I think it's the public utilities. And the public utility can provide lights that are just as good as any other lights. They're not blinking out or flashing, are they?
But one thing I would
over there.
One thing, yes, some of them are probably flashing. But one thing I would add, though, where I think I have a slightly more skeptical or critical view, I often disagree with my teachers, is
that's why we're here.
One of the things that, that Dr. Parenti talked about that I think is really important is democracy, not in the procedural sense, but in the substantive sense of the demos involved in the decision-making process. So CWLP is public in a certain sense, like in a kind of, thin sense. You might even say in a procedural sense. But you could substantiate these public utilities by making them more democratic. So if we had more direct participation in how the utilities function and how the utilities work, how they're managed, right? I mean, I think if we democratize, Hannah Arendt once said, you can't just call a park public if no one's in it. I mean, you can, by which she meant that, that the public requires something, and that thing is us, the public, And so CWLP is a public utility on certain measures, but I think that it's a very thinly public. What we really would like to see is that the things called public, utilities, public universities, are not managed overly by a board of trustees and by wealthy administrators, but by students and by faculty, by people in the city, people in the community whose taxes, if you know how it goes with the state budget here in Illinois, but the state is never supposed to pay its bills, but we are expected to do that. So, but I think we need to rethink what we call public. And I think we should be rethinking what we call a public university, as well as public parks and public utilities.
But look, the public utility will pay a public salary to the president of it. That means he'll get, what, $100,000, $200,000. If it's a private utility, he'll get a private salary, and that'll be $5, $6, $10, $15 million. So that's one thing I don't like. What's so great about this guy? We got to give him $15 million salary. Why do they spend so much on public propaganda all the time, telling us what a great job they do, how selfless they are, how thoughtful they are? That's all I hear from PG&E, that they do nothing but love us and take care of us and all that sort of. Meanwhile, he's got his hand in my pocket, on my wallet. So why wouldn't I oppose that? If some guy held you up on the street and grabbed your money, you'd be angry and furious as hell. You might even put your life at risk to want to pop him one and grab it back or something. But that's what these guys are doing. They're doing it in a system of shaking us down and stealing it from us. It's a form of theft. That's what capitalism is. It's a siphoning up to the top. Those who do less. Profits are what you make when you're not working. If you're working, then, people say to me, oh, yeah, you're against capitalism, but you get royalties on your books, don't you? Your book. I got you there. Huh? I said, look, Jerko, I I wrote that book. I sweat and I wrote that book. I created that book. I worked for days and days and days, over a year writing that book. And the copy editor who went over it, he spent about 4 days copy editing that book. You know, he should get some kind of pay for it, and the editor too, and the salesman who goes out and sells it to the bookstore or to Amazon or whatever. They should get a cut. So don't tell me, you know, I'm not freeloading. We work for it. The freeloader is the guy who owns the publishing company, Macmillan. Macmillan was, it was Harold Macmillan, you know.
Mm-hmm.
He owns St. Martin's Press.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sitting there in my living room, and he comes on the air, Harold Macmillan. You don't remember him. He was Prime Minister of England, an old guy years ago, and he said, and Dick Cavett was interviewing him and said, so what do you do? What do you do now that you're no longer prime minister? You're sort of retired. And he says, well, the family has a little publishing house that does quite well. And he made that little sound, you know, and I want to sit there and I was going, geez. And I wanted to really put my foot through my own television set. You know, that's how crazy you can get sometimes. And I said, he's the only guy who isn't, you know, who isn't contributing anything. He's just skimming the top off. He can sit back and run for Prime Minister of England. The Macmillan family was getting rich on St. Martin's Press, which is still a pretty big press right now. They don't publish my books anymore.
Let me get there are a couple of women. Let me get. You've had your hand up for a while, and then Ronnie in the back, you also had your hand up for a while. So we will have to start to draw to a close. Yeah.
Because the women are being called on now. We have to no.
No, we'll get.
You should always call on women.
Yes, that's what we're doing.
Okay.
That's what we're doing.
Yeah, that's what you're doing at 10 o'clock or whatever.
No. We opened with a woman. We've had a few. We've had Caitlin. We've had Ashley. I don't know your name.
Oh, right. Oh, that's right. We did have some women. Yeah. You did. No, I had a real grievance. I've often given talks and all that, and the Q&A comes, and you know what happens? It's getting better, but you know what happens? 6 hands go up, and guess how many of them are men? 6 men. Mm-hmm. And it goes on, and then I say, hey, listen, I've just answered this number of men. I want to hear any women who have questions, and you see one over there and one over there. And you got to pull them out of it. But not here. I see these women, but now you just have to call on them, though. That's all. Hey. Hey, you got a problem? Go ahead.
He forgets whose initiative this was. My initiative.
Oh, I'm sorry.
He was going to wait another 20 minutes before he mentioned it. Please.
Oh, you're right. But you got to speak louder because I'm a dirty old man. I can't hear anything.
I'm sorry. You mentioned a couple of terms like cannibalism and that it siphons up from the bottom, that the top 2 and 1% are accumulating wealth at an exponential rate, and that it's probably getting to be absolutely out of control. And you said that slowly they're gaining more and more ground and we are losing. And I think
could I just interrupt a second? Which is why there are some left-righters who call it monopoly capital. I didn't use that term tonight, but that it tends toward monopoly all the time in the competition. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Okay. And I think we've seen throughout history there comes a tipping point, and I think we've seen that both sides of these classes are willing to show physical violence. Would you at any point see this as do you see that we're going to keep losing ground? And if we continue to, what do you see the end game being? What do you see being, do you see even there being a tipping point, or that it might just kind of get to the point where we have in the past where we've got a king with a castle and just everybody working in the mud around it? the revolution? How would you see it playing out in the future?
Well, I think...
Should I just try to repeat?
Yeah,
I'm not sure if I'm going to get all of that, but please correct me if I don't capture the question. So there's growing inequality, there's growing oppositions and class conflict of various kinds. What does Dr. Parenti see as where that might go? Is there might be some violence or revolutionary possibilities on the horizon? Is that right? You're interested in finding out where he thinks this might end up?
Because since if we're going to continue losing ground, if he thinks we're going to continue losing ground, and if that happens, what's going to happen?
Okay. Growing inequality, where's this leading us?
When it gets so utterly desperate with the French Revolution, you had the pitchforks come out. You know, Barack Obama himself made a comment to one of these big business groups where he said, you know, I'm the only thing between you and the pitchforks. I thought that was a fascinating statement. He was talking about 1798, the French Revolution, 1797, I forget now. Yeah, but the French Revolution, you had two things. Utter misery. People were utter misery. And two, their opponent wasn't that powerful anymore. I mean, Louis XVI, Louis XVI, I think it was. Louis XVI, Louis the 16th, who went to the guillotine. He didn't have, I mean, his own guards were wavering and turning against him. And you had another class coming along. It was that middle class, that bourgeoisie class, and you had leaders like Robespierre and these people. They were playing for keeps. What frightens me is I think we may end up worse than that with a populace that doesn't fight back, they're too thoroughly brainwashed. They've decided that this is all happening because people are being hostile toward Christianity, or because women insist on getting abortions or something. You know, the development of false consciousness is much more clever than Marie Antoinette sitting there and saying, "You have no food, let them eat cake." You know, and she was preparing her own guillotine. So that's the problem. I don't see it. And then sometimes you don't know. Then you get surprised. You get utterly surprised. Look at those students who did go there. And you're right. They didn't say occupy the Pentagon. I made this point. Well, I wrote somewhere. They didn't say occupy Pentagon, occupy White House, occupy Congress. No, they went to the heart of the creature. Occupy Wall Street. They were saying who, and they put that right on the table. Then you got, you know, we didn't go anywhere with it. We didn't get enough organization out of it, and they got crushed. They all got crushed. But the one big gain they made was the propaganda gain of talking about 1% and 99%. Well, there are those of us who have been for years trying to talk about the great divide between the rich and such. When in a country where people think, oh, we're all middle class. There's a few poor down there, a few losers, you know, and there's a few super rich, but they're nothing. But in America, we're all middle class. Baloney, all middle class. And the middle class is fighting and struggling and is holding on like this, you know, if it's holding on at all. So I really don't know what the future has in store. And then there's the additional pressure. We may be running out of time. The French in 1790 never had this problem, but we are facing an ecology that is in a crisis of a kind that we've never seen. Well, these idiots, they're actually celebrating this, some of them. There are actually now corporations arising that are designed to help people take advantage of the climate change, how they can make money on climate change. They're crazy, you know. Years ago, I said, these people are not going to come to their senses until the North Pole melts. That was my term, the North Pole, meaning the Arctic. Well, the Arctic is melting. It's now melting in my lifetime. I can't believe it. And what are they doing? They're getting up there saying, oh, isn't this good? We can have a Northwest Passage now. So Lewis and Clark wanted a Northwest Passage, right? In fact, Columbus himself was looking for a passage to get around there. And we can do this, and we'll be able to do that, and we can cut off. We don't have to go around Cape Horn anymore and all that. So that's crazy. They really are, and it's causing all sorts of ecological things. The Gulf Stream, the Caribbean Stream, and all that. It's going to change tremendous. It's going to make tremendous changes of climates in the North American continent and even in Europe. It may be a disaster of momentous dimensions, and it may come in your lifetime. I don't know.
And I think if I could just add something to that in relation to your question.
Are you depressed enough now?
Well, I think there is what Dr. Parenti says, I think, is quite right. You can see it in any crisis, not just the climate change issue, but even with something like the devastation of a city with Hurricane Katrina. You get money and capital looks at crisis as investment opportunity. And how can we use this crisis as investment opportunity? And I think part of the answer to your question is, how will we look at the crisis? If we look at the crisis the same way that capital looks at the crisis, then I think that Dr. Parenti's more sort of cynical view, or that possibility of it getting far and far worse, is a foregone conclusion. I think what has to happen in some of these conversations where we inform ourselves here tonight and beyond is we've got to think about something else to do with a crisis than speculate on investment opportunity and how it's going to affect markets that don't have any relation to people's everyday lives. And I think we are capable of doing that. The question is, how bad does the crisis have to get before we start to articulate rival visions, different strategies? Ronnie, go ahead.
Hello, Dr. Parenti. Thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you for coming.
I completely share your critique of capitalism, as Dr. Ardio can tell you. But I have trouble when I hear critiques of capitalism that encourage staying within the monetary system. When you talk about using public services and public utilities and public transportation, all of those things were created out of a crisis of capitalism. So when we continue to use them, aren't you just continuing to kick the capitalism can down the road, so to speak? And when we talk about the ecological disaster that's going to come, as long as we continue to use a monetary system as a way to get what we need, which money does nothing. We can't eat it and live on it. It doesn't do anything for our happiness, our creative ability, our social thing. So if we eliminate a monetary system completely, the only way that that's going to happen is if everything is blown up. I mean, do you advocate socialism as a segue into that? And I don't think that we can look at an ecological crisis and not see the opportunity in it, as long as we're continuing to use a monetary system.
If you didn't have a monetary system, what would you use? I mean, in a complex society like this, we can't have a trading system or,
So where are the limits? And I know this question is going to
But
where are the limits on socialism when you say this is how much is fair, this is how much is going to be made? Where are those limits? And if you like part of the reason.
Well, people don't lose their intelligence. They don't lose their sense of self-interest and other interests. In fact, it gets better under socialism. Look at Mondragon, which is an anarchist. It's not socialist. It's an anarchist organization in Spain. And they started with small, making clocks. Just workers employing workers and nobody else. Workers working for themselves. And it's built up into a a large society. Well, they gave more. They gave a better salary to the top guys who had to stay there late at night and take on more responsibility than the worker. So they developed changes and such, but they weren't stealing from me. When I bought something made by the Mondrigan cooperative workers, anarchist workers, every penny in that went to some guy or gal who earned it, who had been working in it. And so what the monetary system is not, it's a convenience, it's a way of doing it. Now, it's not true. Of course, money was invented with wealth. That is true. That at a certain point, kings could not give 700 fur skins to somebody in the trade, or swap some camels or animals or whatever else. So, or gold plates or different gold cups and all that. So they invented coins, and that became a way of accumulating wealth. It's an instrument of wealth accumulation. That's what's so wrong with a monetary system. But if you don't have a if you don't have kings and you don't have CEOs who are plundering your company and all that, I don't see where the money would be such a danger.
Well, because people are still in the monetary system doing jobs that aren't creative. Like you talked about somebody making clocks or doing something creative, but what about the person who just comes to work here at the university and cleans it up, and they have dreams of doing something else? They're in that monetary system, so they have to stay in the monetary system cleaning up something they don't want to do, or maybe they want to do something else. What about somebody, I mean, I understand how...
that is a tough question.
Monetary is financial, money has been traded.
It tends to do so in opposition to capitalist power, to capital, to the wealthy elite, much to their chagrin. And I think I find that wholly convincing. I think there's a it's not even a question of persuasion, there's a historical record that we can consult that shows us that, quite frankly, the best things under capitalism are the least capitalist things. That is to say, the 8-hour workday is not something that people who ran companies were thrilled about.
Took a century to get to 8 hours.
Took a century.
14, 12,
martyrs,
11.
And in this state, what is celebrated in other countries more than here, May Day, is about part of that long struggle. But I think one of the problems with capitalism versus reality is that capitalism is a mythology, and it has its own mythology, and it's quite disconnected from the reality. And what happens a lot of times is we look around and we see things like innovation, or we see things like something we like the lights, or we have a really good dinner, and we say, damn, isn't capitalism great? Because of the dinner.
Who says that? Who says that?
Nobody really says it.
Wait, raise your hand if you ever say that.
Yeah.
I'm going to kick you out of here.
Yeah. all of the people who have said I've been screened out, they're not here. They weren't allowed to. No. But what my point is that I think we need to stop giving capitalism credit for everything we like in a capitalist world. I think we should give democracy credit. I think we should give the demos credit. So when you look around and you see things that you are really glad we have, we should not always concede to capitalism that it's because of capitalism and its long history that we have those things. There are a whole lot of things that we have, that we love and that we enjoy, that we should take credit for having, and that we should understand where they come from. And they don't come from the wealthiest 1%. They come oftentimes through the demos, from the initiative of everyday people who have demanded their existence.
Right, that's what I was saying, but he said it much better. Wasn't that good?
And thank you very much to all of you and to Dr. Michael Parenti.
Thank you.